Okay, I think that's most people join now, so we will just get started. So welcome along to the final in our series for Lamb Crop 2022. So tonight we're focusing on outdoor lambing. So we're looking towards the uplands this evening. We have had indoor lambing, we've had hill lambing, and now we're at the end with outdoor lambing. Again, we've got some fantastic people. We've got specialists, a researcher, and a leading farmer this evening to speak to you. And our aim is, as always, to maximise the lamb crop by reducing lamb losses. So tonight you're going to hear from some fantastic people about how they implement that. As a reminder, we've had week one, we had indoor lambing. We covered a huge amount of stuff. It is now available. The recording of the webinar is now online, so I will circulate the link for that for anybody who's not got it. The next week, last week, we focus more on hill lambing. And again, we touch from black loss, nutrition, the optimum litter size, genetics. There was a whole host of stuff covered in our hour and a half. And again, that recording is available as well, and we'll circulate that. But tonight we have a great lineup for you. We again have myself chairing it, and we have Poppy Frater, and she is going to discuss nutrition from a completely different angle again this evening. We have heard from her on the kind of basics in energy, we've heard about protein, and now today we're going to be more so on the outdoor system. We also have Neil McGowan, and he's going to talk us through his system and how his system is a success. And finally, we're going to hear from Cathy, who is one of our behaviourists, and she's going to speak about how their behaviour happens at lambing time and how to manage them according to their behaviour. We are on Zoom, so you'll see that we've got a chat function, we've got a Q&A, and we've got raise hand. So you can chat to all participants, or everybody, I think it says, or just the panelists. You've also got Q&A, so if you've got any questions as the evening goes on, please put them onto the Q&A. We'll address them at the end of this evening after all of our talks. And you'll also see there, we've got a hashtag LambCrop 2022 or 22, and we're really looking for you guys to share your tips that you find that is a success for lambing time. So it would just be great to put those up onto Twitter, onto Facebook, use the hashtag LambCrop22, and let's just keep the exchanging of information going after we're finished with our series. So without further ado, we will get started. And Poppy, if you would like to share your screen now. Poppy, I don't think needs any introduction after she's spoken the last couple of weeks. So Poppy is our sheep and grassland specialist with SAC, and I will just hand over to you, Poppy.
Thank you. Is that sharing okay?
Not quite. You're on presenter mode.
Oh, apologies, one moment. There we go.
That's it.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you very much, Kirsten. I am most excited about this one actually because I feel like outdoor lambing and basing nutrition more around grazed grass is perhaps where the future lies when we're looking at increasing fertiliser costs, increasing feed costs. These sort of lambing outdoor systems are less vulnerable to these input prices. However, they're probably more vulnerable to fluctuating weather. So there's a pro and con. Just to recap, as I've shown at all the webinars, this is a fantastic resource. I've got it on the wall up here actually, the EU Nutrition and Body Condition Scoring Timeline produced by QMS. And I think in a way this is, it's probably most applicable again to outdoor lambing. It talks about the body condition score targets along the bottom, so from 3 to 3.5 through pregnancy, 3 at lambing. And just getting them on target really does help, particularly at lambing. It helps buffer that variable grass growth. They can, you know, when they can milk off their back, that's a great way to put them into their lambing. And also for those that haven't heard, you know, the poster draws our attention to the golden 20 days either side of tupping, as this is most influential to scanning percentage, and the golden 35 days in the lead up to lambing time. I've discussed how different types of conserved forage can meet their energy and protein requirements in the lead up to lambing, and where additional energy will be required. So for instance, average hay, they will start needing supplemented from 8 weeks pre-lambing if they're in good condition. However, right up the top here, as you can see, grazed grass over 4 centimetres and growing can absolutely meet their energy and protein requirements right the way through to lambing. And as you've heard me discuss in terms of rumen healthy rations, it doesn't get any more rumen healthy than that. This is where the challenge lies. For an April lambing flock, you really want to try and match, when you're basing your nutrition off grass, you've got to try and match that demand with grass growth. And yes, grass growth is very variable year to year, as I'll show you in the next slide. But there are still things we can do within our control to get this working in our favour. This graph is taken from is an organic farmer actually, and you can see the year's worth of grass growth data he has collected. And I think it's just tells a bit of a story in terms of the times of the year when we have more certainty. The range is quite relatively small, and so times of year we can have more certainty about grass. But yes, absolutely, from sort of end of April, that grass growth is highly variable year to year. However, resting grass through the winter is a key influencer of your spring grass yield. Even back in the 70s, there was research done which showed sheep grazing from November to December reduced yields in the spring by 25%, and sheep grazing from January to March reduced it by 40%. So resting grass through the winter is highly influential to making sure that you've got that grass available come lambing time. So one such method is this practice called all grass wintering of sheep, which sounds quite counterintuitive. But this is a method of rotationally grazing through the winter months. And those first grazed paddocks will be grazed quite tight. They'll be about 3 weeks after tupping time. They'll be grazed quite tight, but they will not be grazed again until lambing time. So those first grazed paddocks will be the lambing paddocks, and they will get the most rest. The nice thing about all grass wintering is that it's the cheapest feed. Grazing is the cheapest feed. So just taking a step back, all grass wintering is rotational grazing. Those that practiced it initially in England were grazing, moving them every day through a series of paddocks of a period of about 100 days. So from 3 weeks post-tupping until about 3 weeks pre-lambing time. They were talking quite high stocking densities, so around sort of 900 to 1,000 ewes on 1 hectare electric fence paddocks. And those first grazed paddocks would have been grazed quite tight in the sort of 3 centimetre mark. But as a consequence of that, it cleaned out the base of the sward, and that spring grazing quality was better for it. So there's a note here, all grass wintering of sheep, which gives a bit more detail on that. But like I say, that's one method of resting the lambing paddocks over the winter, is by using this rotational grazing. Another thing you might do, particularly sort of January, February time, if those that do measure grass are worried, obviously you might just rest grass through the winter by feeding them silage or hay. Grain Lofthouse, who was on the first webinar, said this to me once: it's better to feed 1 mouth than 2. So it's better for me to supplement my ewes in February, January or February time, and save that grass for the ewes at lambing time, when their demand is much higher, when we've seen that we can't meet their needs purely on silage alone, but to challenge to meet their needs at that time, grazed grass can do. So by doing this, you can preserve grass, you can use perhaps sacrifice areas to save grass on the rest of the farm. I've just taken I mean, ring feeders are probably the dominant way of feeding silage. Feeding out on the pasture is another way. But this is some photos I just took from a farm I was on recently of these modified hay feeders, hay or silage feeders that are used to prevent the sheep jumping on, and they get they come in at the sides as they graze, so they work quite well. And then, of course, another way of resting grass is using forage crops. I did mention, it came up in the Q&A, using some things like fodder beet and swedes. You've got to factor in another element in this though, however, particularly crops such as fodder beet and swedes, because they need to be sown relatively early in the season when your grass is tight. You need to factor in that if you're putting in a forage crop, you're losing area as well while the crop is growing. But these crops can work really well. You know, on fodder beet and swedes, you can get you know, over 100 ewes to the hectare over 3 months, and so you stock them quite heavily, and that enables you to rest the pasture during that time. So yeah, so this just shows the sowing window and the grazing windows of different crops. And when it comes to forage crops, basically the things you need to know, they should be transitioned in the same way that the rumen bugs need to adapt to concentrates in the diet. They also need to adapt to different forages. The shock is less severe for the system because it's another forage crop, but it's still a transition that we need to account for. So a way to adapt to transition them will be to provide them 1 to 2 hours of access per day on a full stomach, and gradually increase over 5 to 7 days, and ensure all are eating the crop. They do often require additional minerals. Brassicas are known to create an iodine deficiency, so often they at least require iodine and other minerals alongside it. Key to remember, particularly with bulb crops, is leaf holds the protein. So it's important to try and preserve the leaf, because if you lose the leaf, then the bulb is energy high but protein low, so you no longer have a balanced diet. So strip grazing is the best way. I mean, there's things you can't prevent, like a frost kill of the leaf, but strip grazing just helps preserve the leaf across that crop. And also it's recommended, again, for protein supply, but for a source of fibre, is providing hay, silage or grass even alongside that crop at 30% of their diet. And as always, even through the winter, they do require fresh water supply. Sorry. Now, some people on forage crops find issues with prolapses or over-fat ewes. I would say late pregnancy is too late, really, to correct ewe condition. I would advise against knee-jerk reactions where you're putting over-fat ewes in late pregnancy on a low energy and protein diet, because you'll end up with issues of pregnancy toxemia. So at this stage, it's a case of perhaps managing fat twins with singles, but not putting them on too much of a diet, because there's so much of a challenge on their bodies at that time. So ewes on forage crops can get over fat, and they can be a prolapse risk. And the best means to do it is to control their daily allocation and validate it with condition scoring at scanning time. So yeah, just keeping a check of how well they're eating everything. Are you giving them too much and losing control over their fatness? And there's some, I mean, prolapses is a real lack of evidence because it's such a complex issue. But there are some theories that minerals such as magnesium and calcium are can lead to more risks of prolapses if they're magnesium or calcium deficiency. So providing these minerals can be a help if you are worried. We talk about exercising, so thinking about where you site troughs if they're fed, or where you how the sort of the size of the, you know, just making them move, means to make them move, can help improve that muscle integrity, so they're less likely to have prolapse issues. And then if the flock has been prone to prolapse in the past, I would advise moving the triplets, perhaps even from scanning time, or 6 weeks pre-lambing anyway, if you're at high risk. We heard from James Daniel in a FAS webinar last year about managing triplets in hogs, and he has no issues all the way up to lambing time. But I would just say, if those want to be more risk adverse, triplets are more likely to have prolapses. Those on forage crops are more likely to have prolapses, so you might want to reduce those risks. Another means that's kind of divides people, but another means to improve spring pasture supply is what's called a pre-lambing rotation. So just think of this as mowing your lawn early on in the year. As soon as you start mowing the lawn, it actually promotes the grass to produce more leaf. It promotes the grass to grow. And that's exactly what a pre-lambing rotation does. It grazes off that winter dormant leaf and can increase your spring grass production. So although I've said rest the field during the winter, when you've got to that sort of 100 to 110 day mark, March provides an opportunity to give them a quick graze before lambing time, perhaps in sort of mid-April time. So yeah, grazing the fields in the March can improve their quality, can improve the grass tillering, and improve the grass growth. But you need to judge whether there is enough grass, so you don't have to make knee-jerk reactions to adjust the diet or impact the lambing grass. So my sort of rules of thumb is target 6 centimetres across the grazing area and graze down to 4 centimetres. So to give it a nice clean out, that will improve spring grass production. However, if March temperatures are lower than average, if grass height is not reaching 6 centimetres or ground conditions are poor, then don't graze. So it's a general rule, make sure you've got enough grass before you consider it, but it can be a benefit to spring pasture quality. And then there's a budget down the outline down the bottom here. Example, this is taken from, I'll put it in the link in the chat. This is taken from the Forage First Sheep Systems Guide, which just pans out how many sheep per hectare can be grazed per day. So this is 160 sheep per hectare per day in this instance. The cost of being short, I think this is a very valid thing to consider in a year like this year, with nitrogen price through the roof, and also with spring being unpredictable. Yes, we're moving away from feeding, but there are years that we might be caught out. So if pasture height is predicted to be, for instance, 3 centimetres, in this scenario, I might consider means to help alleviate that issue. So in April, I'm assuming a relatively good response rate, so that might change things slightly as well, April conditions. But on this basis, at 1 to 20 nitrogen response rate, at quite a low rate of nitrogen, but at quite a high price, and perhaps climbing now, that would cost £2.28 per ewe. So that's based on 10 ewes to the hectare. Feeding, I've just put 2 lots of prices because I know there's a mixed bag, but feeding is often recommended if you don't have 4 centimetres of grass for ewes and lambs during lactation. It is recommended that you feed, because that will lead the ewes to be more likely to have mastitis issues, because the lambs will be pressuring them too much, and also it might affect the lamb growth rate. So feeding 0.7 kilos for a week at £280 a tonne, that comes out at £137 a ewe, and even at £3.50 per tonne, that's still competitive with nitrogen fertiliser. And also by feeding at this time, it gives you it gives you time to see what's actually the conditions are when the time comes. With nitrogen, you have to make that decision ahead of time. However, the downside of that is disturbance. And then just to put it out the cost of doing nothing. So if these lambs' growth rates are reduced early on in lactation, it can have a big effect on them for the rest of their life. And that's, I've just put this assumption that the growth reduced by 50 grams, that equates to 37.5 days more on farm. And if the grass is cost at 6 pence per kilo, that leads to £3.60 per ewe. Now we can argue with this 6 pence per kilo, because if I've got lots of grass, then it's actually not worth that. But if I'm limited in grass, it's worth more. But I'm not factoring in the labour, the health costs and other things of keeping lambs on farm longer and the risk of mortality. So we can argue that one a bit further, but I'm just trying to put a value on what that 50 grams lamb growth rate is worth. And then I just wanted to touch on some other aspects that influences mortality outdoors. Mob size is something that's really undervalued. There's a fantastic FAS note on this, Promoting Lamb Survival Outdoors, Lessons from Down Under. And you can just see from this research the influence of mob size along the bottom to lamb survival. The greater the numbers in a group, the lamb survival decreases. Just think about the mismothering issues that occur. So suggestions: triplet bearing ewes, no more than 30 per group, twins no more than 50, singles you don't need to worry so much. Lambing management, of course, shelter is important, and water provisions. I put a guideline to stocking rates here, but you kind of need to kind of work out as you go what's feasible, what works. There's a guideline for starters. Buckets can be useful, particularly as a bit of an insurance. If you're worried about grass supply, they can be a bit of an insurance. Well-designed buckets are designed to complement grass, not replace it. And I put a question mark with drift lambing, so it can work both ways. You can move the ewes that have lambed out the paddock, leaving those that haven't lambed, or you can leave the ewes that have lambed and remove those that are due to lamb. And I guess the benefits of that is that you'll have a group of lambs of similar age, so it'll be good for management later on. But the disadvantages, you might be creating more disturbance. So it seems to defy people outdoor lambing, drift lambing. I always put this as a question mark, whether it's valuable to wean sooner. Just to remind you, the AHDB feeding the ewe, based on a thorough literature review, has shown the optimum lamb weaning age at 12 to 14 weeks. So we estimate that at 13.5 to 15.5 weeks from the start of lambing. And that'll just provide that bit more opportunity for those ewes to gain that all-important condition in time for mating time. It just gives them that bit more opportunity. And then Neil's going to talk a lot more about genetics, but just some sort of general rules about selection management. And these rules will suit yourselves. What are the sort of tasks that you don't want to be doing much of? Do you want to be assisting much? Do you want to be disturbing much? You know, you kind of, somebody once said to me, we wrote a list of all the things we dislike doing, and we ticked them off with our selection management. You know what I'm talking about. So yeah, so an idea of some rules: born unaided, suckled unaided, born within the first 17 days, weaning weight cutoffs, no dags, no feets, no other issues, born and reared as a twin. They can be simple rules, or they can be more specific. And then also on the other side of the coin, culling those that are barren. Those are prolapses. I mean, prolapses isn't necessarily heritable, but those that are prolapsed once are likely to prolapse again. Any lambing difficulty, and Neil will talk more scientifically about that. Teeth issues, perhaps, age, perhaps, feet issues, disease often comes into it, and other issues. And lastly, something I haven't discussed much is managing the next generation. This is really, really influential. If you think about the proportion of the flock that gimmers make up, their scan can make a big difference to your overall result. And that really does come down to reaching these targets, so percentage of mature weight at certain times. And I think sometimes we're guilty, particularly if the ewe lambs aren't mated, is kind of leaving them be for too long and not focusing on achieving this target for mating as a gimmer. It really does have a big influence on the results of your flock. So at 6 months for a ewe lamb, you should be seeking to achieve 60% of the mature weight, and then for gimmers it should be 80% at 18 months. So in summary, I haven't harped on as much about condition score, but it is still important and highly influential to your rearing success. Do what you can. I know there's stuff out with your control, but do what you can to encourage more grass in the spring. There are things we can do. Forage crops are a great way to save grass, but just be mindful of the fact that you're reducing that grazing area, perhaps in the spring. Mob size is a huge influencer of lamb survival outdoors. Use genetics, you'll hear more about that in the next couple of presentations, but genetics for minimal input and disturbance. Let the genetics do the work for you. And ewe lamb and gimmer nutrition really should be prioritised to ensure the future of your flock productivity. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Poppy. And I have put some links into the chat box as Poppy was speaking there. So we've got the forage for sheep systems, and there's also the technical note that she spoke about there as well. So now, Neil, it is your opportunity to give her a shove, move her over and let yourself come over. I'll just let you get your presentation up, Neil. And obviously the next one up is Neil. Anybody who doesn't know Neil, he comes under many hats. He is a Nuffield scholar, he's an award-winning farmer, he is hugely innovative, and Poppy has teased a bit towards what he may speak about this evening. So Neil, are you coping with getting your screen on?
Thank you very much. Is that it on, I think?
No, we're still on Poppy's.
Still on Poppy's.
She's just refusing to leave, isn't she?
Okay.
It's on our screen.
I'm pleased to be down here in a cupboard in the SAC office at St Boswell's this evening.
You're in presentation mode there, Poppy.
I don't know what's going on.
So that Poppy can press all these buttons and get this mixed up.
That's you now.
Okay, but that's where the arrow is where we usually are, just on the Perthshire Angus border, and that's sort of where we are and who we are, I think. And basically, we're sort of run a 1,200 acre farm, which is between 350 and 700 feet. We get about 45 inches of rain. We do a little bit of cropping with some sweets and forage crops. There's 3 generations of us on the farm, and we have a full-time and a part-time help. Mostly on the cattle side, we run about 200 cows alongside sheep, and we've been farming here for 26 years. On the sheep side, we've run between 1,000 and 1,300 ewes. About 120 of these are pedigree Texels, and the remainder clins, either bred pure or to the Texel. And we're lambing mostly outdoors in May. The Texels are a little bit earlier indoors and out. Some are grazing permanent pasture, and we have some sown grass clover lees. And in the autumn, we're getting about 50 to 70% of lambs finished off grass and red clover, and the rest on forage crops, mostly rape and stubble turnips. And through the winter, we're quite lucky. We've got a fair bit of cow grazing area that we can use for tupping ewes on, and then we move on to forage crops. The ewes are we've scanned ewes today off Swedes, and we sell some breeding rams and some breeding ewes, about 1,000 store lambs, and a couple breeding ewe lambs is sort of what we do. This is a wee bit how lambing works. The texels are lambed inside and out from about the 25th of March, and the clins are all outdoor lambed. We use an EID record management system, which is Debbie, my wife's in the picture in the bottom here, reading a ewe. We've been recording ewe behaviour scores for about 20 odd years. When we look at lambing difficulty and assists in the flocks, our stud clin ewes are worked out this year. We assisted 6% of the ewes to lamb, and the clin gimmers were about double that at 12%, and the pure texels were 45% assists, which included 8% difficult. And these are all numbers that we're trying to work on, because I think sheep we need to make these things a bit easier. Lambing staff at lambing time it's really all just the pair of us, Debbie and myself, although we've been helped quite a bit by lockdown and homeschooling in the last couple of years with some children. We're checking ewes probably about 3 times a day. I thought I'd maybe just start by discussing some of the mistakes we've made along the way, because we've done quite a lot of that. We started off drift lambing, which was something that my father worked very well with. But I always found that when we lambed a lot of ewes in one field and then shifted them, moved the unlambed ewes on, the day or the couple of days following that, we seemed to get quite a bit of pinching. And I remember reading something that Cathy wrote once, and I sort of tried to understand the ewes' behaviour behind that. And so we moved away from that. We have lambed and moved on. We've lambed. We have lambed, and this is something we still do with singles, particularly. Mob quite a lot of ewes together in a field to try and maybe control the grass if we've got a very good spring, and then walk ewes and lambs through a gate out of that field. But that's we find that's quite time consuming, but it's still good for singles. But I think in general, having quad bikes has made life a lot easier, and to be able to split sheep up as much as possible. We probably spend quite a lot of time driving around, looking at sheep, not doing anything, and I don't really mind that at lambing time. Some fields are a bit of an issue, and you just got to try lambing in them, and you know that you don't want to lamb in that field again. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Snacker feeding is something we try not to do, and just try and keep things quiet in the fields. Gimmers, for a while we went through. We were working on not wanting to put all our gimmers into one field to lamb, so we split them through amongst the ewes. And which meant we've not got 10 gimmers all of a sudden lambing in one day in the same field. But we've probably found we're getting less mastitis issues with gimmers if I can have a mob of gimmers and grannies, pinch a phrase from Charlie Walker, that we can put these sheep in probably the best fields, the most sheltered and the most grass. And I think probably zooming around, chasing our tails, to try and be just calm and methodical about the way we're going round sheep is something we've learned to do over the years. And I think just coming to the realization that you can't be everywhere, and it's best to maybe just stop trying to be doing everything. So what ideal looks like to us is probably is lambing onto grass with all the sheep's nutrition just a few meters away from her nest spot. I've probably picked 2 photographs that don't really look like that, but an ideal ewe, I think, you can probably see her picking her nest site 2 or 3 days before she lambs. She maybe doesn't spend all the time there, but you can see ewes scoping out where they're going to lamb, and you know, in a couple of days' time, you see them back there with a lamb. We sort of drive past at a distance, hopefully maybe a couple of hours old, and you see lambs like on the left that are happy and sucked, and they're getting dried up. And we'll come back in 24 to 36 hours, like the lambs on the right there. They're still in the ewe's nest spot, and we've caught these lambs and rung them and put a number on their side, tagged their ears, and and we know after that that the lambs with the numbers on them can pretty much be ignored when we're going around checking. That marking, we're tagging, ringing, putting this number on, scratching for off. We actually weigh the lambs and score them, and then there's no further intervention required for these lambs until they're 6-7 weeks old. And then at 17 days from the start of lambing, probably walk out any unlambed ewes, and you're ended up with just one field to check after that. And this all depends on a bunch of things, probably. The pheasant. We're lucky to have a neighbour that is keen on shooting pheasants, and he's very good at controlling the predators around about. And I think without the pheasants, outdoor lambing becomes a little bit trickier. I think knowing which sheep to catch and which sheep to leave and which sheep to return to is a very awkward thing to do, and it's probably just something that comes with experience. And I think it must be very difficult to do that if you're employing someone to do the lambing for you. And I think you know, if it's your own sheep and you take your own risk, it's a bit easier. I put thinking and driving here. Driving around the field, keeping the revs steady and the speed steady, and picking the path of least disruption through the ewes and lambs is something which is quite important, just to keep things calm in the lambing field. And when things go wrong, and it does go wrong, and you've got to catch ewes, I put a picture of my dog up here. This Jack Russell's my sheepdog, and I think you should be like my dog and don't take my advice when it comes to catching sheep and handling that. But you have to get over that hurdle. And I've put also, it's going to get dark at some point, and when it does get dark, you've just got to stop. If you've at some point you've just got to stop and walk away. You know, when it's getting dark and it's the end of the day, you don't want to be going back into fields really and disturbing things that you might not have enough light to sort out again. I think it's quite important that if you're thinking about moving to an outdoor lambing situation, that you develop a system that suits you and your farm. I think that's the first thing to do. And then secondly to that is develop a sheep that suits that system. We tried a lot of sheep on our journey into outdoor lambing, and the Lleyn seems to work for us in our situation and our farm. We wanted a ewe that would lamb easily and would stick with her lambs at lambing, and we wanted lambs with plenty go about them. So we started taking lambing behaviour scores, and every lambing event that we record the lambing ease, the mothering ability, and the lamb figure, and that's just three numbers that we write in a lambing book, based around 0, and we give a positive score for something that's good and negative for something that's bad. And it's a very simple thing that we can look up back in time and make decisions on later on, trying to cull out negatives and select positive scores in our breeding programme. This is hopefully a wee video about a gimmer that's a first lammer with us. That our lambs will just be, they'll be about a day old, and we've just got them and marked them here. She's an example of what we think is a really good mother for a first time lamb. She's got herself away in a quiet corner and had her lambs by herself, and she's very, she really wants them back. Oops. There we go. The lambing book, we do keep a lambing book because we were both born in the 1970s, and we just do that. We have a handheld reader, but we don't trust it very much. So we have we keep scores in a lambing book, and the example up in the corner of the screen there is taken from the lambing book, and we've got mother, sire, number born, weights of lambs, tag numbers, and this score. So a 0, 1, 0 is a lamb itself was pretty good mother, and the lamb was fine. There's another U there with a 0, 2, 1, which was a lamb itself was a very good mother and was a pretty hardy lamb, probably with a good birth coat. That score started off looking at suckling issues, and a -1 would be needed to suckle, but we don't see that really now, so we've really stopped doing that, and it's now more of a score on birth coat, I think. The main picture there is a ewe from this year that broke the system. She scored a 3 for mothering because we had to retreat onto the quad bike to get away from her. She was beating us up trying to get her lambs back. So I think we've moved the behaviour of the ewes quite a bit. In the 20 years since we've been doing that, we've made quite a difference there. The graphs I have to thank Sam Boone from Signet for, and I've got a graph here about optimum fertility, which I think is probably the #1 maternal trait that we can look for in sheep. The columns, each column along and the bottom axis there is a sort of a mini flock of all the ewes in the Lleyn recorded population, split up by the number of lambs born EBV. So the ewes on the left are the lowest number of lambs born EBV, and the ones at the right the highest. And the column shows what they have produced as a lambing percentage in their own mini flocks over the years. So the grey bit at the top is triplets coming in, and the blue bit down the bottom is singles and twins in the middle. So the bottom half, the poorer half, the lower the lower fertility ewes are the ones on the left-hand side of the graph there. They've obviously got too many singles, and the top quarter, I think they're ewes that have well, the ewes they're having too many triplets for an outdoor situation anyway. The more fertile they've got, they've not had any less singles, they've only replaced twins with triplets. So I think for practically getting lambs on the ground outside, we need to target that little band in the middle, the optimum ones. So they're working out at about 20% singles and between 10 to 20% triplets. and leaving 60 to 70% twins in the middle. That's the Lleyn stud flock at home. That's our scanning percentage, or our percentage in different brackets there over the years. So we're in that sort of 60 to 65, we're here 70% twinning up at the top. And in the grey line there, that's the twinning. The singles in the orange over time have increased, but we're still in about the sort of 20% area. And the triplets and quads are both sort of, we've decreased that over time as well, sort of in the sort of 10% bracket there. So I think we're probably needing to select sires that are a little bit more prolific than we want to be, but we really need to. I think it's a very important job for us to get sires that are in that that optimum range for number of lambs born. Another Signet here, I've developed a lamb survival EBV. So the database doesn't really know why and when lambs die, but they do know when hundreds of thousands of lambs have been born, and if these lambs were weighed at some point later in their life. So that gives them an ability to pull together a survival EBV. So this is a new EBV, but it's they've gone back through time to pull it together. And this graph here shows some of our own rams' progeny's survival over recent years. So the I might need Poppy to help me explain this graph, but I think what it's showing is that we've got 2 or 3 years data missing, because it's a new EBV. Some of the recording protocols haven't just been set up yet, and we've got a problem with some of the blank ones. In 2012, the survival rate was just about, the average for that group was just about 95%, just short of that. And the system requires we need to have 95% or less survival before it shows any sort of variation. So if it was any higher than it was that year, these figures would have been discounted. Have you got anything to help me out with here, Poppy?
So the full extent of the line in the graph shows the full range in the ram survivability of their progeny, doesn't it? So the top where it hits 100%, that's their exceptional rams. They're one sort of individual ram often that's achieved good survivability. So
yep,
fair. And then the lines in the middle of the plots is the average of all those rams. And then you've got the bottom quartile, so it's the middle line to the extension of the box, and then the bottom rams at the end of the line.
So I think what that's showing you is there's quite a lot of variation through the year, and I do remember 2018 was a bit of a lambing season.
Yeah, so it's quite nice. It says on the side the variation due to seasonal effect, so that's when you're challenging your genetics the most, isn't it? So, yeah, good.
So the difference in taking the top 3 and the bottom 3 sires over these years on lamb survival EBV, the actual difference in the lambs that they brought home was is round about a 4% difference. And that was just an example of how we try to get that data across on our ram sale catalogue to people that are looking with the EBVs that are available on the Lleyns. We're looking at litter size slightly below average on this ram on the top, and another again about average here. The other ones we've been looking at on birth weight and lamb survival. And then the scores for each lambing event of the mother. And on Texels, we're looking at a birth weight EBV and also a lambing ease EBV. And these are all fairly new EBVs. They're available if you can find them anyway. And I think as the information is growing, these EBVs are becoming a bit more useful and accurate. And that's about where I am. For more information on that, there's a bit on the Signet website and a good EHDB thing too. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you, Neil. A huge amount of information there and very impressive graphs, I have to say. So brilliant, thank you. Cathy, do you want to bring your screen up now? And we'll move on to the final speaker of the night. So we've got Cathy joining us now, and Cathy is going to join all the dots together that we've heard of so far, and she's going to enhance a bit on what Neil spoke about with behaviour. So Cathy, over to you.
Thanks very much, Kirsten. I'm just trying to get my slideshow to appear. There we go. Can you see that all right?
That's it. Perfect.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Yes, so thanks very much, Kirsten, for the introduction. And it always makes me really happy to hear someone like Neil talk about these things, because I think the ewes on his farm are really being given the best opportunity to show their maternal behaviour, and that then leads to improved lamb survival, which is really what I'm going to talk about today. So I think when we think about outdoor lambing, the ewe is trying to achieve the same things, whether she's indoors or outdoors. So everything is sort of driven by her biology. And really what I'm going to try and do is explain a little bit about the sort of biology behind some of the things that Neil's talked to you about, what the ewe is trying to achieve. And I'm not going to tell you how to do things, because you'll have different things on your own farm. But I think if we can understand what the ewe is trying to do, what her biology is directing her towards, then we can give the ewe opportunity to show the behaviors that we want. And so that's really what I'm going to try and do, is just to put a bit of that understanding behind it. Because when things go wrong, it's not because the ewe got up in the morning and thought, I just can't be bothered with a lamb. There's always something biological that's happened or has failed to happen because of something that's around the ewe, so that there'll be a scientific sort of biological explanation for it. And so I'll try and sort of explain what some of those might be. So when the ewe lambs indoors or outdoors, she's going to show the same kinds of behaviors. When she's outdoors, she has more opportunity to make choices about birth sites or nest sites, and we heard Neil talk a bit about those. She potentially has more space to get away from other ewes, to form a relationship with her lamb without those sorts of disturbances. There may be less other stressors, noises, disturbance, people coming and going, those sorts of things which can have an impact on her behavior. The one thing, of course, that we can do something about in an indoor system is we can protect the ewe and the lamb from the weather, from predators, and it's a little bit easier for us to help out if something goes wrong. So outdoors, the ewe has some advantages, but we also need to try and optimize things that help her look after the lamb on her own, because it's going to be more difficult for us to provide that assistance. So when I think about these things, obviously you'll have many management goals, but the two that I think that I'm going to focus on today is, ideally we want the ewe to rear the lambs herself. We don't want to be raising the lambs, that's the ew's job. So we want her to show good maternal care. And of course we want the lambs to survive. And for most of what I'll talk about today, that's really about what happens when the lamb is a neonate, when it's a young first few days of life. So it has to show appropriate behaviour at that point. And again, Neil talked about scoring lamb vigour and those sorts of behaviours as well. So I'm really going to focus in on what things affect the expression of this good maternal care in particular. We'll touch a little bit on neonates, but I'm really mostly going to focus on the ewe tonight. So I thought I would start by just and some of you may have seen some of this before, it's just giving a sort of overview of the many and varied reasons why we might lose lambs. So sometimes they die before they're born or at birth. so the abortions and our stillbirths. Sometimes they die at birth, and that can be because of birth difficulty and dystocia, or having a difficult delivery is one of the main contributors to lamb death. There can be things that for some reason cause that can give us functional disorders that just prevent the lamb from showing the right sort of behaviors. It's got to move from this sort of warm, protected environment inside the ewe into what's quite often quite a difficult, cold environment. It has to start breathing, it has to start thermoregulating, it has to start showing behaviors for the first time. And sometimes those things can just not work properly. When the lamb comes out, it's at risk of starvation, hypothermia or chilling, not forming a good relationship with its mother, and it becomes vulnerable to infectious disease. And finally, as it gets a little bit older, or from birth onwards, it's also vulnerable to predation, and that can vary, of course, from farm to farm. And some lambs will die from sort of unknown causes, really, or accidents. But we do know that almost half of, or around half of all lamb deaths before weaning will occur on the day of birth. So that's our stillbirths, our lambs that are born alive, but then fail to survive. And about 3/4 of death occurs in the first 3 days. So that's a really important period, that birth, when the ewe gives birth, and the relationship that forms with the lamb. And that's really what I'd like to focus on. So here are some of the things that are going on when the ewe gives birth. This is going to sort of build up a bit, and you'll see how much more complicated it gets. And this is a simplified version of all the things that are going on. So the first part of this is, if the ewe can have an easy delivery, that's beneficial for all these things to work from her point of view. I'll talk a bit about oxytocin in a moment. That's a real important contributor to the ewe showing maternal behavior. So this is a change in her behavior to showing the licking, the grooming, the low pitch bleating, the letting the lamb come to the udder. And then the sort of culmination of that behavior is that she suckles the lamb and forms a bond. Alongside this sort of behavioral outputs, she also needs to produce milk, to produce colostrum, and for that milk or that colostrum to have sufficient immunoglobulins in it for the lamb. At the same time, the lamb also needs an easy delivery. That's important for its own vigor, its own survival. It has to be able to get up on its feet. It also has to be able to find the teat. Those two things aren't quite the same. So that standing up is important, but also knowing how to find the udder is important. And that leads to the lamb sucking, and that's part of the bonding of the lamb to the ewe. So you can see that the behaviors of both of them are leading towards sucking and bonding. And those are really the key things that we want to happen when the lamb is born. There are lots of things that can have an effect on these behaviors. So the blue boxes are the ewes, and the orange boxes are the lambs. Some of these things, if we're thinking about lambing outdoors in the next month or 2 months, some of these things will have already happened. The age of the experience, you've already made decisions about who you're going to mate, who you're going to mate with who, what breed. Probably you've also thought about pregnancy nutrition already. If we're in the last stages of pregnancy, as Poppy's already mentioned, there's limited things that we can do to manipulate that. The placenta will be well grown, for example, by now. But there are still some things around the lambing environment, thinking about the conditions under which the ewe is going to deliver her lamb, and the conditions under which the lamb is going to be born and reared. And so those are some of the things that we can still have an impact on in terms of how well this sort of behavioral interaction that's sort of in the center of this slide is going to work out. So just to go back to when the lambs die, and I'm really going to focus in on that period of birth and the early responses of the lamb, and what's going on in terms of the ewe and lamb biology when we think about what happens. So there are some challenges at this point for the mother and her lamb. A difficult delivery has an impact both on the ewe and on the lamb. So for both of them, it's painful. It's hard work for the ewe. There's risk of injury to both partners. So the ewe can be injured internally and externally. The lamb can be injured, and sometimes that can be through our attempts to get the lamb out. So it's at risk of broken ribs, dislocated shoulders, those sorts of things. If the ewe's been laboring for a long time, she can also become exhausted. She just runs out of reserves to carry on, and that pain and the energy that she's putting into delivery can be pretty significant. And for the lambs, they're at risk of hypoxia or lack of oxygen through that birth process. So there are risks and challenges for both the mother and the offspring during the birth process, which is why it's such a high risk of mortality. When the lamb is born, it has limited reserves. It has a little bit of a sort of backpack of brown fat that helps it cope with its initial time outside the ewe. So obviously up until the point it's born, it's the ew's been keeping it warm, and now it has to do that for itself. So its two main jobs are to keep warm and to get on its feet so that it can get to the udder. At the same time, particularly for an outdoor lamb, when it's wet, it's losing heat as soon as it hits the ground. It comes out warm from the ewe, but it starts to lose heat to the air and to the ground. It loses more heat to the ground than it does to the air. So getting onto its feet helps it reduce that loss into the ground. But if it's cold and wet and windy, the rate at which it's losing heat to the air will increase. But the ewe can help with that by licking and grooming the lamb. She can remove some of that wet amniotic fluid, the birth fluids off the coat and help get the lamb dry. She'll also sort of fluff up the birth coat, and that can act as an insulator. So there's a sort of an interaction really going on by how much energy the lamb has to use to stay warm and how quickly it's losing energy, losing heat to the environment. And that's going to be really affected by where the ew's chosen to lamb. So how protected is that environment, what sort of shelter there is, the weather, of course, and also what she's doing to help warm the lamb up. So the quicker the lamb can get on its feet, it reduces its heat loss to the air. But it also means it can get to the udder and it can start to replenish those reserves. And so then it is not at this sort of risk of running out of reserves before it's suckled. And it can start to use that energy to stay warm. So there is this really quite short window for the lamb, particularly if the weather is bad, for getting to the udder before it runs out of energy that it's been born with. And this is really where obviously the birth weight and the nutrition of the ewe comes into play, because that has an impact on the amount of reserves that the lamb will have when it's born. So how long that period of time is. So, and I'm sure you've heard this many times from many of us, that one of the really important things then for the survival of the lamb is the period of time from birth to getting sufficient colostrum. And that time window is really important for the future survival of the lamb. And this interaction, so when the lamb ingests colostrum, has three main tasks. So the first of those, of course, is to replenish those reserves. So make sure that the lamb can avoid starvation and hypothermia. So that's the key thing first off, is to make sure the lamb is able to stay warm and isn't hungry. It also has an impact on the strength of the relationship between the ewe and the lamb. So it prevents mismothering by helping the ewe and the lamb bond to each other, and particularly the lamb to bond to the ewe. And so that close contact between the ewe and the lamb also reduces the risk of some of these other causes of mortality, like accident and predation. And of course, colostrum also is important for the passive transfer of immunoglobulins. So that provides immune support for the lamb, so prevents it from being vulnerable to infectious diseases and watery mouth and so on. The colostrum also helps close the gut up, so that it reduces the risk that sort of bacterial infections can pass over the gut into the lamb. So it has lots of functions in, which is why it's so important for the survival of the lamb. And that ability to get colostrum into the lamb is because of these different behaviors from the ewe and the lamb. So the ewe shows these licking behaviors, low pitched bleating. She stands still to let the udder come, the lamb come to the udder. She's not aggressive towards the lamb. She's willing to attack anybody who's going to try and get to her lamb. She's protecting that offspring. But she also forms a smell memory, an olfactory memory for her own offspring. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is in a moment. And for the lamb, it has to be active. It has to find its way to the udder and suck. It has to be able to take on the sort of breathing, the thermoregulation, all those sorts of activities that it didn't have to do before it came out of the ewe. And these interactions lead to both the ewe recognizing her offspring, but also the lamb recognizing the mother. They both try and stay close together. They have frequent sucking interactions. They get quite distressed if they're separated, and that helps get them back together again. And then the mother shows sort of vigilance and protection of her offspring. So I wanted to really then just focus in on about where maternal behavior comes from, how it's regulated, how it's managed in the ewe. And there's a sort of a very tightly controlled set of behaviors, a set of physiological signals, biological signals that cause a ewe to show maternal behavior. She doesn't know to be a mother when she's had a lamb. It's because of these sort of biological signals. And those come from things that happen in pregnancy, during labor, and at birth, and then specifically signals from the lamb, the birth fluids on the lamb's coat, which help her focus her attention on the lamb. So in late pregnancy, and that's usually about 2 days before the ewe is going to give birth, there are biological changes that occur in the lamb, and those are triggered, that occur in the ewe, and those are triggered by the lamb. So the lamb, if you like, tells the ewe sort of physiologically that it's time to be born. And it's the lamb that triggers that process. And that leads to behavioral changes in the ewe before birth. And we heard Neil talk a little bit about those already, about choosing that nest site. And so particularly in an outdoor lambing ewe, she has the opportunity to get away, move away from the rest of the flock. She might seek shelter, but she might just move to the outside of the flock, sometimes along the fence lines. Often sheep will move sort of to the outskirts of the flock, which can help reduce interference from other ewes when she's lambing. She makes a choice of her birth site or her nest site. And that's a really important place because I think, again, as Neil talked about, she's going to go back there. That's where she's going to have her offspring. There's some evidence that the longer she spends on the birth site, the better quality of bond she has with her lamb. And it seems the better that the ewe learns about the environment that she's lambing in, she's able to make better choices in terms of her birth site. So again, I think Neil mentioned that in his experience, that when they moved unlambed ewes into a new environment, the ewes were less familiar with where they were giving birth, and they had more difficulty choosing a birth site, and there were more problems. This is what happens biologically. So these are some of the data that we've collected in sheep in the 5 days before the ewe gives birth. So if you look at the axis along the bottom, this is time with the ewe giving birth at time 0 over on the right-hand side. And so you can see that's in hours, but it's 5 days before on average the ewes gave birth. And this is for 2 different hormones. So the blue is progesterone and the red is estrogens. And progesterone is usually high. It comes from the placenta. It's high during pregnancy until 2 days before the ewe gives birth. And then you can see at the 50-hour mark, it starts to drop down. And progesterone really acts like a bit of a handbrake on estrogen. So once progesterone starts to drop, and that's actually that dropping of progesterone is in response to the lamb signal. That's when we start to see estrogens suddenly shoot up. And you can see that there's this, over the last 2 days before the ewe gives birth, we see this huge rise in estrogen. And the change in these 2 hormones is really getting the ewe ready to be a mum. It's like she sort of, we think about it as she's primed. So she won't show maternal behavior from these signals, but these need to happen. Otherwise, she's not going to show maternal behavior, or not very efficiently. So at this point, when she moves into labor, she's had this change in hormonal state and she's sort of ready to give birth. And then there's other signals that come while she's in labor, and in particular, the stretching of the birth canal as the lamb comes through. And what that does is makes her attracted to the smell of amniotic fluids, not just her own, actually. She'll be attracted to the smell of amniotic fluids of any ewe. But if she's on a birth site and she's away from other ewes, when the fluids come out as she's in labor, she's attracted to that site. And that's one of the factors that helps keep her on the birth site. When she gives birth, she has a sort of a window of about half an hour to an hour when she is in the right state to form a bond or a memory for the smell of her own lamb. And so it is quite short, and there's quite a lot of sort of biological processing that's going on in her brain, which really make her able to form that memory for the smell of her own offspring, her own lamb. And what she does is she's initially attracted to the birth site, and then because the lamb smells like the birth site, because it's got the same birth fluids in its coat, she then transfers that attraction to the lamb. So her licking the lamb, which helps dry it up, and her rumbles or her low-pitched bleats are part of her nurturing or looking after the lamb, but those are also really important behaviors for because what she does by licking the lamb is she learns the smell of her own lamb, and that's how that bond is formed in the first 30 to 60 minutes. And again, if we go back to what's happening in terms of biology, there's this really important hormone called oxytocin. And again, this is looking at time along the bottom, but now we're looking at minutes. And the ewe gave birth in this, well, this is several ewes, they gave birth at that big spike in the middle. So that's, well, you can see the sort of time along the bottom. And that, so even about 30-40 minutes before she actually delivered the lamb, there was hardly any of this concentration, any of this hormone in her blood. But when she gave birth, we had a 10-fold increase. So 10 times as much of this hormone was suddenly released into the blood, released into the brain of the ewe. And this is like flicking a switch in the ewe's head. And that makes her want to take care of the lamb. So if we don't get this oxytocin peak, the ewe isn't interested in forming this bond. So it is like a oxytocin switch for maternal behavior. But you can also see that falls down very quickly again. So again, within half an hour after having given birth, all that oxytocin has disappeared. And it's oxytocin that opens that opportunity for the ewe to form a bond with her lamb. So the lamb has a bit of a job in all this as well. It's not just the ewe, but it's mostly about smelling right for the ewe. So having the right smell, the birth fluids in the coat, which helps keep the ewe interested in the lamb. So we know that if ewes can't smell, they're less interested in the lamb. So ewes that have lost the sense of smell are often less interested in licking the lamb, and they can't form this sort of selective memory of knowing who their own lamb is. The lamb does have to get up and get to the udder and suckle. So it has to have this activity and coordination. And that sucking interaction helps maintain the bond. It helps the ewe carry on wanting to look after the lamb. So if the lamb can't suckle, the ewe will eventually lose interest in the lamb because she's not getting that extra contact. And every time the lamb suckles, it also causes an increase in oxytocin. So that helps keep that wanting to look after the lamb alive in the ewe's brain. So a really important part of being a mother for the ewe is not just taking care of the lamb, but it's recognizing who their own offspring is as well. And this means that they only show maternal care to their own lambs or the lambs they formed a bond with. So it starts being that the recognition comes from smell. which is why smelling and licking is such an important behavior for the ewe when the lamb is first born. Later on, they also learn to recognize what their own offspring looks like. And they can recognize lambs' bleats as well to a certain extent. And I'm sure if you've watched sheep in the field, you'll know that when a lamb bleats, quite a few other ewes will answer. And then there's a bit of back and forth between the ewe and the lamb. And then they decide, okay, this is my own lamb. So they're not brilliant at recognizing just on the basis of the lamb's voice, but they usually have to have a bit of chat back and forth to decide, yeah, it's my lamb. We know from some of our work that ewes that spend a lot of time licking right after the lamb is born are usually quicker at recognizing who their own offspring is. They are better at looking after the lamb, and they often have a closer relationship in the field as well. So that high levels of maternal behavior and licking is pretty important for good maternal behavior. The important part of this is something that we'd call selectivity. So this is about the ewe learning to identify which lamb is hers, and then she will reject other lambs. So she can tell, this is my lamb, you're not my lamb. But that is based entirely on this interaction with her own lamb soon after birth. And she forms a new smell memory with each. So if she has twins, she'll form 2 different memories. So just because she recognizes one lamb by licking it doesn't mean she's automatically going to know who the other lamb is. She has to lick that lamb as well to form that bond. And so they need to have that opportunity to interact with the lamb soon after birth, to have that licking, to form that memory. Because if the ewe misses that window and the lamb, she's unable to lick the lamb because she's exhausted after a difficult delivery, the lamb has wandered away and she hasn't got back with it again, she won't know that that's her lamb. So even if we reunite them later, often that's when we see rejection of the lamb, because the ewe hasn't learned that this is hers and she now thinks it's not her lamb, and so she's not interested in looking after it. And this can also be when we might see mismothering, that if a ewe has licked another ewe's lamb and formed a smell memory for that lamb, that she thinks that's hers, she's not able to tell which lamb she gave birth to and which one she's lost. She's just, it's based on that smell and that licking. And they also need to maintain that contact. So although it lasts quite well, it doesn't last forever. If the ewe is separated from her lamb for a day or 2, then that contact will start to wane and that interest in the lamb will start to disappear. So that's the sort of biological process. And then sometimes it doesn't work. So I just wanted to quickly mention, I know Kirsten needs me to stop talking, so I'm going to go really quickly through some of the reasons why it might not work. So we know that inexperienced ewes are, the whole biology needs to work really beautifully for an inexperienced ewe for this to work. A more experienced ewe can sort of make some shortcuts, but a gimmer needs everything to work. There is impacts of undernutrition and difficult delivery on these signaling pathways, and that means that it may be less likely to work out. If the ewes are disturbed around lambing time, they can delay birth. So although the lamb triggers birth, the ewe can decide when on the day she's going to give birth, and that can lead to prolonged labor, which has an impact on the ewe and the lamb. And often they may interact less with their lambs, perhaps because they're being disturbed, and we get this reduced bonding. If they're moved off the birth site too early, they may be less good at transferring that attachment from the birth site to the lamb, and that can have an impact on mismothering. And there are breed differences in how much maternal behavior is shown, which can be related to the success of the bonding. So just some real quick take homes. It's really important that both the ewe and the lamb are doing the right behaviors. They both contribute to survival. And if we can work with the biology of the ewe rather than against it, then that helps her to have the best opportunity to form these bonds. And then she's going to look after the lamb herself. And really just to skip down to the bottom one, I think, again, Neil sort of covered this in some ways, that spend a lot of time driving around looking at ewes, but not doing so much is really what we will give the ewe the best opportunity with the time and space to do the things that she's actually been biologically primed to do. So she's got all these signals that that are going to lead to a successful bond with her lamb. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cathy, and well finished up. There is a vast amount of questions come through, so we'll maybe just go to the questions. Cathy, that's perfect. And Poppy, do you want to emerge again? There we go, we've got you back. So there's a heap of questions have come through. Poppy and Neil have been answering some of them as they have, mostly Neil, I've been answering them as they've come through. I'm going to address some of the ones that haven't quite been answered, or if there's been a few people ask the same questions. So I'm going to give Cathy a little breather after just speaking, and I'm going to attack Poppy since she spoke for so long. And you spoke about fat yows, Poppy, close to lambing, and you didn't want them to lose condition too quickly. What about thin yows?
Yeah, again, it's quite difficult to correct the condition close to lambing, thin or fat. So you'd hope to be on track before that sort of 6-week period, but making sure they're getting the allocation. I guess the challenge lies with thin ewes, particularly in singles, is you might lead to lambing difficulties. You put too much nutrition into them in the lead up to lambing. So yeah, just thin twins I'd put with triplets, so they're on that bit better nutrition, and thin singles I'd put with twins.
Awesome. Neil, I'm coming to you next. So you spoke about your scoring on lambing, ease, mother ability and vigour, and you're slowly but surely getting those figures to where you want to be, and you showed like your scanning percentages and stuff and see how they've moved. What is actually your next goal? So once you completely nail where you want to get with those 3 things, what's next? Because I don't imagine you'll stay still.
I think that lamb survival, we're seeing, there's good variation there, and if we keep challenging our ewes and showing that variation, we'll identify the winners and the losers, and I'd like to shift that up. Our lamb survival figures as a flock fluctuates somewhere between 80 and 85%, I would say, and there's definitely room to improve there. That's from a scanning figure to a marking figure. So I think there's opportunities to improve that, I would say.
Okay. Poppy and Cathy, this is a bit of a double question, so I'll let Poppy speak and then Cathy. So it's round about yow lambs, and it'll be good actually to hear your side of this as well, Neil. And it's lambing yow lambs, so there's a range of questions. What's the best mob size for them, Poppy? How do you target nutrition for them, Poppy? And for Cathy, so you spoke about them moving to their field in plenty of time, and when they've not had the biological processes in the past, do they need to be moved to that field for a longer period of time so that they know where they can choose their birth site? So Poppy, you first, then maybe Neil, then Cathy.
Can I transfer the mob size question to Cathy too, because I think she'll know more about that than me. But on nutrition side, again, it's in the last 6 weeks, you don't want to be overfeeding your lambs. So often in pregnancy, we're saying feed them more than their mature counterparts, but because you want them to be gaining frame and gaining weight alongside that fetal growth. But in the last 6 weeks, they should basically be treated and fed the same as the mature ewe counterparts. So a single bearing ewe lamb should be fed the same as a single bearing mature ewe, not giving them too much, perhaps even tighter than that, because you're risking lambing issues. Mob size, I'm presuming smaller the better, again for ewe lambs. Mind you, most of the time they're singles, so yeah, I'll pass on to Cathy now.
Okay, Neil, have you any thoughts on the questions? I've chosen to ignore the benefits of lambing ewe hoggets and would just lamb as gimmers. So, but I guess in terms of lambing them, the singles we tend to lamb in fairly big mobs but very tightly stocked, and take using lambs out of them. And the twin gimmers lamb them with some old ewes to calm the mob down, maybe, and keep them with lots of shelter, a field that's got lots of options to go and lamb different places, and just to try and help them do things a bit easier would be my experience with gimmers. But we don't really lamb ewe lambs.
Okay, and Cathy.
I can't remember what my exact question was, but I think the issue I sort of whizzed through inexperience at the end there. So what happens biologically, I suppose, with when it is biologically, so the same processes happen, but when the ewe hasn't done it before, whether she's a gimmer or a ewe lamb, it's less efficient. She's usually less efficient in her pregnancy. So in terms of how much nutrition that she eats gets to the lamb, because some of it's going to growing for herself. The placenta takes quite a lot of energy, and she needs more of the energy to grow a good placenta. So again, that's another thing that stops food, nutrition getting to the lamb. And all those biological things just need a little bit more help to work, because it's the first time she's ever done any of these things. And a lot of the changes in hormones are triggering other things, and they've never done it before. So they all need a bit of a sort of tune up, you know. It's like, it's almost like learning to drive a car. The first time you get behind the wheel, it's, oh, there's so many things to do, and then you get more experience. And it's sort of a bit like that as well with all these things. So they all have to fall into place. So gimmers and ewe lambs can be fantastic mothers, but they kind of just need a little bit more support, because they're a bit more on a knife edge. You know, things go wrong more quickly. So an experienced ewe sometimes doesn't need the oxytocin. She'll want to be a mum because she's, you know, the estrogen and progesterone levels have changed. She's already got some receptors from last time, and it's like, boof, she's away. She wants to be a mum. Whereas that almost never happens with the really inexperienced ewes. They need all these things to work out really nicely. They need time with the lamb to make that transition from the birth site to the lamb. And although they can do it, of course, I mean, they have to lamb once anyway, and the ewe lambs can do it, but they are also, I think, on even more on a knife edge, you know, that if the nutrition isn't really good for them, then they're a bit more vulnerable. If the litter sizes are bigger, they have more difficulty raising twins and triplets the first time. They can usually raise a single as well as a more experienced ewe, but as soon as we put a bit more pressure on them, then they start to find it a little bit more difficult, because they're just inexperienced and they're just learning how to do all these things.
Brilliant. Massive topic to just summarize in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, give me another hour or two and I'll tell you a bit more about it.
Final question for the night, because I'm very cautious of time, but in the indoor lambing, we had quite a lot of chat about spectam, and there's been quite a lot of questions this evening about iodine. So Neil, first of all, do you dip iodine for the lambs outside? And then Cathy, if he does catch them, or if people do catch them in iodine navels, does that disrupt the bonding process? So Neil first.
I don't generally. If it's particularly wet, or if there's someone's landing a muddy bit and it's not disturbing the ewe so much, it's something I would do. And if I was doing that, maybe put a dot on the lamb just to know it's a pair, or something to help in case of any mismotherings. But I tend to try and leave them alone.
Okay, and Cathy, your side was, does it, if you do it, does it disrupt the bonding process?
I'm going to be a typical scientist guy. It depends. I mean, I would always do it inside, because the risk of infectious disease is much higher indoors. So I think it's more important indoors than outdoors, because however clean you are, you've got more ewes and lambs together and you've got more risk. We would always try and, I would try and leave them alone for as long as for a bit of time. And I would be careful about how I did it, but it does depend on your ewes. So your more maternal ewes, it won't really disrupt them. If you're careful, one of the things that we always do is make sure we haven't picked up one lamb and treated it, put it down, gone and picked up another lamb, because you'll have some, particularly if it's still wet, you'll have some fluids from one lamb on you, on your leggings or on your, you know, on your hands, and then you're potentially transferring that smell to the next lamb. And so you're just increasing again the risk, remembering that smell is really, really important for the ewes when the lambs are newborn. But if the ewe is licking the lamb really vigorously and she's not bothered by your approach, then it won't have any impact on bonding.
Brilliant, thank you. There's still loads of questions coming in, so Poppy and Neil, you'll see them at the keyboard there, ferociously trying to type in some answers there. So I just want to say a massive thank you to our speakers for this evening, also to our funder, who is the University Innovation Fund. There is actually ROSA points for the Register of Sheep Advisors available for this evening. There's 2 points available. So if you are registered with them, then please do just pop me an email with your ROSA number, your name and your postcode, please, and I will get those points for you. We'll also send around a quick survey tomorrow just to get some feedback from you guys of how you found this webinar, as well as the series of webinars that we've done. So we will get all the recordings online. We'll send you a link for them, and we'll also make up some fact sheets just with the main points from both indoor, hill and outdoor lambing. So I think it's been a great success, this series, and I'm just letting Poppy and Neil finish off their questions there, but I can thank them for joining us this evening, as well as Cathy. It's been great. We've covered so many different points there again tonight. It's been a whistle-stop tour of outdoor lambing in the last hour and a half. So thank you very much and good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.